Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Davina Lloyd, and I'm the chair of the steering committee of the CEDAW People's Tribunal. And with me today is Lesley Abdela, who's well known as a woman's activist over 30 years, having had many influential roles, both as a consultant, a journalist, an NGO leader, and a gender advisor. Currently, she's a senior partner in Shevolution Consultancy. But I mustn't forget that many of you may well know her as being the first political editor of Cosmopolitan magazine. Good morning and welcome, Lesley. We've got a lot to talk about today because you've been involved in so many things. So I'd like to start with talking about the 300 group, this plan to get more women into Parliament that you were very, very influential in. Can you start telling us a little bit about that?
Yes, my first awareness of how few women there were in Parliament was I was working as a researcher in the House of Commons for preparing speeches for MPs. And I came home in my lunch break one day and the whole place was flooded with women queuing up to lobby their MP. And I said, what's going on here? And they said, it's an abortion bill being discussed. And I couldn't believe the fact there are all the women in the lobby and all the men in the Parliament on an issue that affected women so profoundly. Then the next thing that awakened me on the few women in Parliament was I stood for Parliament myself in the 1979 general election. I wasn't elected, not because I was a woman, I was standing for the smallest party at the time, the old British Liberal Party. But it was the election when Margaret Thatcher became Britain's first woman prime minister. And the back context for that was she was actually one of only 19 women out of 650 members of Parliament, 3%, the same as Afghanistan at the time. That's where we were. And that really shook me. And I bellyached about it for a while, sort of to friends and so on. And somebody said, why don't you do something about it? So got together with a group of people and we launched this group we called the All Party 300 Group to get more women into Parliament. And I was sort of leader of it and one of the main movers and shakers for about 5 years till I ran out of money because we were all doing it unpaid. We had about 43 groups in the end across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So lots of people did lots of stuff on it. Cutting that short, ever since the group has launched, the number of women in British Parliament has gone up at every single general election. So it's gone in the right direction. However, that was 1979. So I think it's 40 years ago. My maths isn't so good, and we're now about just under 40%. I think it's 33%, just under 33% women in Parliament right now. There are quite a few countries now with over 40% women in Parliament, and Rwanda, of course, was 61%. But it's sort of the half full and half empty bottle. And a schoolgirl said to me a while back, before we were all locked down, she said, it's outrageous. I've just heard there's only 32% of women in Parliament. And I thought, here was me thinking, we've got to 32%. And I thought, she's right. We should be outraged that there's still only about 32% women in Parliament. The downstream of all this is important because it's not just the numbers, it's how much power you've got to influence things. And right now, it's not just the number of women we've got in Parliament, but it's the lowest. What has happened is the number of women in cabinet has gone right back. I think it's about 21%, something like that, women in cabinet now, the same as in 2004. It went up to about 27% to about 2 years ago. And it's gone straight down. So very few women in cabinet. They've abolished the mechanisms we used to have, like the Women's National Commission, which were this really important interface between Parliament, government, and women's organizations in Britain. There were about 500 women's organizations of all sorts that belonged to the Women's National Commission. The secretariat of the commission was funded by government of the day. And what was good about it was a two-way dialogue. It was very useful for governments who wanted to feel what the feeling was on any policies they were developing and so on, because the message could go out to over 500 women's groups and they could get feedback. And the women's groups had a voice into government and parliament. That got thrown out, not because it was the Women's National Commission, but it was typical of what happens. They were invisible. When the coalition government abolished a whole lot of quangos, literally the baby went out with the bathwater. We lost the Women's National Commission. I don't think they even noticed, actually. Invisibility. Women are always invisible. So that went out. Earlier, the Labour Party had got, so I'm trying to balance politically, so the other side had got rid of the Equal Opportunities Commission because they had decided to put all the sort of equalities in one basket, people with disabilities, the elderly, etc. And women slid to the bottom of being important in that one because it's all in one basket, whereas the Equal Opportunities Commission helped with accountability. I think Britain was taken to the court more than any other European country, not because we were worse, but because we were the envy of other women around the world, because we had a mechanism for saying, you know, on pensions, on pay and all sorts of things, for actually holding the government's feet to their fire, whichever government it was.
What you're saying, Lesley, is that basically we've lost our voice and we haven't had a voice through all those years of austerity. We don't currently have a voice with all the impact of COVID is having on us, and we need that voice back. Now, I know that the COVID one is also something that you are particularly concerned about. And I have to say that I've been working with another group, Back to 60, and they have films out on this, documentation out on this, because for the older group of women in particular, and for women on the front line and all these sort of things, it's been a huge, huge impact and will continue to be as we go through the next period.
Now, this is where I get jumping up and down with absolute frustrated fury. Because when you look at who was making decisions on COVID, we don't quite know who is, but within the inner sanctums of number 10, cabinet, whoever, there is this group, SAGE, which are medical experts, etc. But there's not an equivalent group that would represent the voices of women that could have prevented some of the, or mitigated, perhaps not prevented, some of the issues. For example, they would have immediately said, okay, if we're going to have lockdown, how do we protect? What can we put in place immediately to help protect women's violence in the home? You can't stop it, but the women would have spotted immediately with that policy, you need to mitigate, you need to have extra communications open, etc., etc. They would have spotted, and perhaps in discussing and future thinking, when they started to say kids could go back to school or can they not go back to school, or are we going to have childcare or not, that the back story of this is many women who were at home with their husbands or boyfriends or girlfriends or whatever, but they've got anchored because they can't go back to work in case the school or the children shut down. On the other hand, they need to work. So there were a lot of things which you might not have been able to stop happening because of the emergencies and so on. But I've worked in emergency situations I've worked altogether in 50 countries around the world on women's issues, women's rights, etc. And there are certain things you can try and do because you can spot it happening before it happens. And you could advise and mitigate and prepare, not for everything, but they could have done. There is no mechanism at the moment that I can see that's a two-way dialogue for not just, oh, we'll put 5 women into cabinet or 1 woman into cabinet, as we seem to only see 1 woman at the moment visibly. But it's not that. It's hearing the voices of the women around the country through the channels of these so many fantastic women's organizations that we've got in this country. And we're not using, the government loses out from not listening as well. And of course, as you rightly just said, with austerity, there have been so many downstreams issues happening to women because, again, of their invisibility, whether it's widows, pensioners, young women, older women. There's so much, over half the population, because we're over half the population, are not having an input, a proper input into the decision making at such a critical moment of the economy's, going to be very, very serious. And these sort of policies that they'll need to work out about economy as well as the health issues, etc., are going to affect women so much, and they're not having a say. Sorry, I had my rant.
No, that's exactly at the point that we're at, and this is why the CEDAW People's Tribunal is so important, because our aims are to do just what you have said, to give that mechanism, give that accountability, to get CEDAW into domestic law. And I think something also that we need to highlight is the fact that the UK hasn't even had a CEDAW representative on its committee in 41 years. And that's something
Absolutely.
else that's the aim of our tribunal.
Absolutely. I was just going to come to that. That's the next rant. My next rant, because it's all linked. Some of us have been pushing for the last 14 or 15 years. Every year, we try and get the government to nominate a woman from Britain to sit on the CEDAW committee. That CEDAW committee looks at countries around the world and makes recommendations. Each country has to draw up its CEDAW report. And you have usually, from most countries, the official government report, and then the shadow report, which is drawn up usually by NGOs and civil society. So you get the two reports. And the CEDAW committee makes really good recommendations. I've just been doing some work in in Sri Lanka. I was also in Nepal a few years back. But each country looks at the recommendations and they know that they'll be named and shamed in the next 4 years' time if they haven't started to do stuff. One of the roles the Women's National Commission used to do was to help draw up the shadow, bring it together, the shadow reports and the official reports. And they did very good ones. And we were very respected, Britain, for what we did. But we never put up a representative to be on that committee. Now, I now know the reasons. It's a sort of Buggins turn. It's like everything else to do with women. It's the things that are not noticed. How many people in Britain have heard of CEDAW? How many people care if there's a representative on the committee? Not a lot, because it's just invisible. And for the CEDAW committee, I've had meetings after meetings with the Foreign Office and people, the people who nominate, each year. And apparently what happens is all the countries bargain for all the different committees of the UN, because CEDAW is a United Nations committee. And each year they decide, who are we going to put which committee is Britain going to put all its weight behind? That means put some money into lobbying and I assume taking people out to lunch. I don't know. This is an assumption, but whatever they do. And so they'll say, oh, this year we've decided Human Rights Committee. This year we've decided that committee, but never is it CEDAW. And each time, and this is a matter of government policy and priority. And when you think of all the squillions they've been able to find for the last few months, quite rightly, to try and prop up what's happening, and they couldn't find a measly few thousand, I doubt it was anything near 1 million. Even millions don't sound much these days, everybody's talking billions, but a few £1,000s to put behind lobbying to get a representative from this country on the CEDAW committee. Why not? So this is another example of the invisibility. We had a little chat before this interview, and I mentioned to you that it reminds me of Sherlock Holmes stories, all this. Because the reason Sherlock Holmes apparently was very successful was he used to spot the invisible clues. And my partner happens to write Sherlock Holmes novels, so this is how I know about it. I don't normally read Sherlock Holmes. But there's one famous story, which I think a lot of people know, called The Dog That Didn't Bark in the Night. And there was a crime committed. And Sherlock Holmes arrives, and he looks around the household and he says, by the way, there were more than 6 in the bubble, this particular household. He looks around the household and he says, oh, I see you've got a dog. Did any of you hear the dog bark last night when the crime was being committed? There was silence. Nobody heard the dog. Aha, says Holmes. That means one of you must be the criminal. It was the invisible clue. You know, normally people would say, well, if the dog didn't bark, I wonder who did it, sort of thing. I think this is what has happened in the last few years to women's voices into government. We need CEDAW, this tribunal, partly because we need the CEDAW embedded into our laws, but also because having these discussions might make these issues visible again to government. They say they are doing these things, but they've got a lot on their plate. They're mostly, at the moment, people making the decisions, as far as I can see, are mostly men in a certain age, probably about my son's age, I'd say in their 40s or 50s or whatever. No, he's not quite that age. But certainly, it's not women's voices that are, and I don't mean individual women, I mean collectively, all the various expertise, all the experience there's not a two-way conversation, which could be helpful. It's not just helpful to women and helpful to any government.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lesley. And that's exactly what we need, women's voices to be heard. So please, everybody, get behind the CEDAW People's Tribunal and let's get this done and make history and sort things out for over 51% of the people in this country once and for all. Thank you very much, Lesley. Thank you.
Thank you for doing this, Davina.